In the quiet aftermath of war, when historians sift through the rubble of choices and consequences, one question stands out like a hammer striking steel. What could have ended the bloodshed faster? In 1946, British historian B.H. Littlehart asked that very question to captured German commanders, expecting a tactical answer, a discussion about tanks, air power, or supply lines. Instead, he was met with an indictment blunt, precise, and chilling. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, looked him in the eye and described a gift the Allies had unknowingly handed Germany in September 1944, a gift that cost tens of thousands of American lives and prolonged the war by half a year. Littlehart realized, as he listened, that this was not about a failed maneuver or a poorly drawn map. This was about lost time, time that might have silenced the guns months earlier. Every grave dug between September 1944 and May 1945 became, in retrospect, a choice, a consequence of hesitation rather than necessity. By late August 1944, the German army in France was no longer just retreating. It was unraveling. The catastrophe at the Falaise Pocket had shattered entire divisions. Tens of thousands were dead, tens of thousands captured, and the highways were strewn with abandoned tanks, artillery, and trucks, all rendered useless by fuel shortages or broken command structures. Commanders had no soldiers. Soldiers had no orders, and Germany's vaunted military machine had become a collection of fragments, machines without operators, men without weapons, units without cohesion. When Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take command of the Western Front, he confronted a nightmare. Known as Hitler's fireman, the man dispatched to every critical front to extinguish disasters. Model found nothing left to save. What remained were fragments of units, clerks pressed into combat, teenagers, elderly men, soldiers in name only. On paper, Germany still had an army, but in reality, Model had fewer than 100 operational tanks across the entire Western Front. Meanwhile, the Allies were poised like predators, 12 armored divisions ready to strike, the roads to Germany open, and intelligence reports confirming what their soldiers could feel in the field. German resistance was collapsing faster than they could advance. There was a sense of inevitability among Allied troops. Whispers that victory could arrive by Christmas, but unseen from the front lines. The brakes had already been applied hundreds of miles away by decisions made in offices and war rooms. Patton's Third Army reached the Meuse River, the final natural barrier before Germany itself, and beyond it, the thin, barely manned Siegfried Line. Beyond that, the industrial heart of the Reich awaited, almost undefended. Every report from Patton's intelligence officers carried the same conclusion. The German army was broken, and one concentrated thrust could have ended the war. Walter Model, aware of the precarious state of his forces, scrambled desperately to hold the line. Every day without an Allied breakthrough felt like a miracle. He gathered every available man, pulled units from quiet sectors, and clung to time, the one commodity that might save Germany. Time was exactly what the Allies provided. On September 1st, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed direct command of the Allied ground forces, faced with a decision that would define the course of history: strike with overwhelming force along a single axis into the heart of Germany, or advance broadly to maintain unity across the coalition. One option promised speed and a decisive victory, the other political harmony. Patton argued for the concentrated strike. American doctrine supported him. German defenses could not withstand it, but coalition politics complicated the choice. Bernard Montgomery insisted on priority in the North. Churchill lobbied Roosevelt to elevate British forces, and Montgomery threatened to bypass Eisenhower entirely if denied. Patton, politically toxic due to past controversies, could not be publicly elevated without uproar in Washington. Then came the logistical problem. Antwerp, one of Europe's largest ports, had fallen on September 4th, but the Scheldt estuary remained under German control, rendering the port useless until cleared, a task assigned to Montgomery. Instead of action, he proposed Operation Market Garden, a daring airborne assault to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands, promising a Christmas victory. Eisenhower agreed. Priority went to Montgomery. Fuel and transport aircraft were redirected, and American tanks sat idle while the path into Germany remained open. Patton warned that halting now would grant Germany the gift of time. No one listened. On September 17, 1944, Market Garden launched, the largest airborne operation in history, and failed catastrophically. British paratroopers landed on top of German units, trapped and destroyed, with barely 2,000 escaping from 10,000. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The war would not end by Christmas, and the tragedy extended beyond the men lost. Fuel never reached Patton's tanks. Momentum was sacrificed for a shortcut that led nowhere, and Germany's forces, under Model, revived like a phoenix from the ashes, rebuilding defenses, conscripting factory workers, and preparing a counteroffensive. In those 6 weeks, Germany was gifted life it did not deserve. By October 1944, Model had not just rebuilt what remained. He had reorganized the shattered remnants of Germany's western defenses into a formidable line. Reserves were activated, new formations trained, and the West Wall reinforced. What had been scattered units and empty roads was now a coherent, if desperate, defense. The Allies, meanwhile, were still recovering from the catastrophe of Market Garden. Momentum that could carry them straight into Germany had been squandered on a gamble, and every delay gave Model the breathing room he needed. The political pressures that dictated Eisenhower's caution had unknowingly handed Germany a reprieve. What should have been a swift and crushing advance became months of attritional warfare through forests, rivers, and fortified lines. Little Hart, in his interviews with German commanders, came to understand the stark truth. The Allies had not been defeated by German brilliance or tactical genius. They had been slowed by hesitation and political compromise. Every delay, every compromise, every debate over resources was a gift to the enemy. The Germans themselves did not veil this reality. Gerd von Rundstedt, in particular, articulated with clarity what historians would later call the September window, a period when Germany was so exposed that a concentrated, relentless assault could have ended the war almost immediately. Rundstedt explained that the Allies had the forces, the intelligence, and the opportunity to deliver the killing blow. What they lacked was a willingness to risk the political friction that such a concentrated attack would have caused. Bernard Montgomery's obsession with northern operations and the desire to keep all armies advancing in concert had spread Allied strength too thin. Patton, with his tanks idle and his divisions frustrated, represented the one commander capable of executing the strategy Rundstedt and others had feared. Yet coalition politics kept him restrained. The Germans knew it. They watched and waited, confident that time was now their ally. The consequences of this hesitancy were staggering. Autumn descended on the European front, and the battles dragged on. The Hürtgen Forest, a dense and unforgiving woodland, became a symbol of unnecessary suffering. American soldiers fought through 3 months of freezing mud, trees, and relentless German resistance, only to take ground that could have been bypassed entirely if the Allies had struck decisively in September. Casualties mounted. 33,000 men lost for terrain of little strategic value. Every lost life, every telegram sent to grieving families, carried the weight of decision that could have been different. While these battles raged, German generals sat in captivity or behind lines, calmly analyzing the situation, fully aware that the delay had been provided by the very commanders who sought to defeat them. By November, Model was planning Germany's last desperate measures. His forces, now rebuilt and reorganized, were ready to launch an offensive of their own choosing. The Ardennes, a quiet sector earlier in the year, became the staging ground for the counterattack that would shock the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge. The German High Command had survived September and October precisely because the Allies had spread their forces too broadly and delayed decisive action. The offensive was meticulously prepared, exploiting the thinly held fronts, and initially achieved remarkable success. 75,000 American casualties in just weeks. Thousands more captured. Entire divisions surrounded and surrendered. The Reich had been granted a second chance, and German generals openly admitted it. The concentrated Allied thrust that could have ended the war in September never came, and Germany used the breathing space to mount one last desperate gamble. Little Hart's interviews reveal more than tactical hindsight. They expose the profound consequences of leadership constrained by politics. Rundstedt, Otto von Manschenfeld, Kurt Meyer, Walter Model all agreed the Allies' broad front strategy had been fundamentally flawed. It was not the brilliance of the Wehrmacht that extended the war, but the cautious, politically influenced decisions of their opponents. Supply lines stretched, ports delayed, command decisions compromised. These were the factors that gave Germany life when it should have been finished. The Allied High Command, attempting to balance coalition harmony and operational goals, inadvertently created conditions for one of the deadliest periods of the war. German commanders recognized this immediately. They understood the difference between fighting a competent opponent and one constrained by bureaucracy and diplomacy, and they exploited it without hesitation. Perhaps most striking was the unanimous German assessment of who posed the greatest threat to their survival. Patton, with his aggressive, rapid, armored advances, represented exactly the kind of decisive force that could have shattered their lines. Rundstedt reportedly told reporters after his capture that Patton was the Allies' most dangerous commander, the one who embodied the speed, aggression, and relentless pressure capable of destroying the Reich before it could recover. In contrast, Montgomery was methodical, predictable, Omar Bradley competent but cautious. German generals had faced all three and knew that only Patton had the temperament and strategy to deliver a war-ending blow. Yet coalition politics and logistical bottlenecks prevented the Allies from unleashing him at the crucial moment. Eisenhower's political acumen kept the alliance intact, but it came at the cost of months of unnecessary fighting, thousands of lives lost, and the prolongation of conflict that could have ended far sooner. The lesson of September 1944 became painfully clear over the coming months. Every delay in exploiting Germany's weakness, every compromise to maintain coalition unity, gave the enemy time to regroup. Rivers, forests, and fortifications became scenes of avoidable carnage. The Siegfried Line, which might have been outflanked when weak, had to be taken by bloody frontal assaults months later. Winter transformed battlefields into frozen hellscapes, but the losses were not inevitable. They were the product of decisions made far from the front, in conferences and briefings where speed was sacrificed for politics. German generals, observing from their perspective, understood that the war could have been decisively ended in 1944, and they articulated it with a bluntness that was almost haunting. This was professional military analysis, devoid of ego or excuse, laying bare the consequences of Allied hesitation. The winter of 1944 brought more than cold and snow. It brought the consequences of choices made months earlier. Germany, given a reprieve by the hesitation of the Allies, now struck back with devastating precision. The Ardennes offensive, known today as the Battle of the Bulge, was not an act of luck. It was a result of the time the Allies had granted them. Walter Model, Gerd von Rundstedt, and their fellow commanders had used every resource available to rebuild shattered units, reinforce defenses, and plan a counterattack that would exploit the thinly held sectors of the Allied lines. When the German forces rolled forward in mid-December, they achieved total surprise. Thinly defended positions crumbled. Entire divisions were surrounded, and American forces, unprepared for such a concentrated blow, suffered catastrophic losses. The numbers were staggering. 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks, nearly 20,000 dead, and over 7,000 prisoners from the 106th Infantry Division alone, the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in the European theater. The irony of the Ardennes offensive was not lost on those who later studied it. This last desperate German push succeeded in part only because the Allies had previously spread their forces too broadly. The very strategy intended to maintain cohesion among American, British, and Canadian armies had produced a vulnerability the Germans exploited. Each compromise to appease coalition partners, each delay to respect political concerns, directly contributed to the scale of the disaster. For young soldiers fighting in freezing foxholes, the nuances of coalition politics were irrelevant. They endured 3 months of grinding, bloody combat through forests and lines that could have been bypassed months earlier if the Allies had concentrated their might when Germany was truly weak. Every casualty, every life lost, was a silent testimony to a command structure that had valued diplomacy over decisive action. The German commanders, now in captivity, were remarkably candid about their perspective. They did not claim victory for brilliance or heroism. Instead, they openly acknowledged that the only reason they were able to mount such resistance was the Allies' own caution. Rundstedt, Manchefeld, Meyer, and Model all echoed a single point. A concentrated Allied thrust in September 1944 could have ended the war before Germany could recover or launch a final offensive. Every debate over resources, every attempt to balance coalition demands, had given Germany a lifeline. The broad front strategy, which Eisenhower implemented to maintain political harmony and alliance unity, had been fundamentally flawed from a purely military perspective. It had been a strategic gift to the enemy, a gift that extended the war through winter and forced countless unnecessary deaths on both sides. In analyzing the chain of events, one fact stands out. The Allies possessed a means to destroy Germany quickly, and they had the opportunity, yet they hesitated. Intelligence reports, field assessments, and on-the-ground observations all indicated a German army on the brink of collapse. Patton's forces, poised for rapid advancement, sat idle as market garden consumed resources, lives, and momentum. The roads into Germany lay open, yet the tanks could not roll, the armored thrust could not strike, and the war dragged on. The German generals knew it, and they acknowledged it without reservation. Patton's aggressive tactics, the speed, the pressure, the relentless pursuit, were exactly what would have shattered the Reich. Yet politics, pride, and coalition management suppressed the very commander capable of executing such a decisive strike. Speed, they said, mattered more than harmony. Concentration beat dispersion. Patton embodied both, but he was held back by factors beyond his battlefield decisions. Every German General Littlehart interviewed described the same stark reality. The Allies' hesitation had given Germany months of life, months to rebuild, reorganize, and prepare. The forests of the Ardennes, the fortified Siegfried Line, and countless fields and towns became scenes of bloodshed that might have been avoided. The sacrifices of young soldiers, many of them barely 19, could have been reduced if the coalition had acted decisively in September. Yet history records a war as a long campaign through autumn and winter, battles fought for ground that should have already been secured, and victories that were delayed by months. The disparity between military possibility and political reality shaped the final months of the European war, and German commanders recognized it with clarity and precision. They understood the difference between the Allies' ability to win and their ability to end the war swiftly, and they knew exactly what could have been done. Rundstedt went further than mere critique. He explained the ideal course of action. According to him, a concentrated strike, focused on northern Germany, supported by overwhelming armored power and Allied air supremacy, would have torn apart the weak German front and forced the Reich to collapse before it could reorganize. Berlin might have been the ultimate political objective, but the real power lay in northern Germany. Whoever controlled that region controlled the entire country. The German general's analysis was professional, unflinching, and brutally honest. They were not trying to rationalize defeat. They were providing an objective account of what could have ended the war faster and why it did not. Their testimony paints a picture of opportunity lost, of lives expended unnecessarily, and strategic mastery thwarted not by enemy brilliance but by hesitation and compromise. It is a haunting reminder of the consequences of indecision at the highest levels of command. As winter tightened its grip on Europe, the consequences of the Allies' hesitation became painfully tangible. The Ardennes offensive was the starkest example, a brutal testament to the months Germany had bought through Allied caution. In 6 weeks of relentless combat, American forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties, countless men frozen or mangled in the snow, the horror compounded by the knowledge that much of it could have been avoided. The Germans, rejuvenated by the breathing room granted in September, exploited every weakness with ruthless efficiency. Young soldiers, barely trained, were thrown into fray on both sides, enduring snow, mud, and the constant threat of artillery fire and ambush. Entire towns became temporary fortresses, streets and forests turned into killing fields, and the casualty list grew longer with each passing day. The cost was staggering, the suffering immense, and the tragedy rooted not in the ferocity of the enemy, but in decisions made hundreds of miles away in command centers far from the frozen front lines. Walter Model, Gerd von Rundstedt, Otto von Manschenfeld, Kurt Meyer, they all recognized the pattern. Every delay, every political compromise, every attempt to maintain coalition harmony had strengthened the German position. The broad front strategy, conceived to avoid alienating British and American commanders, had inadvertently given the enemy the time to regroup. Every allocation of resources to appease a political faction or satisfy an Allied general came at a price, a delay in the advance, a lost opportunity to strike at the heart of a collapsing German army. Littlehart's interviews revealed a remarkable unanimity. The Germans did not claim genius, only that the Allies' hesitation had saved them. Every delay had a name, every pause had a cost, and every compromise could be traced directly to lives lost and battles prolonged. The logistical struggles added layers to the tragedy. Antwerp, captured in early September, could not immediately function as a supply port because the Scheldt estuary remained under German control. The clearance of that vital route fell under Montgomery's responsibility, yet he delayed decisive action. American divisions, tanks ready and waiting, could not advance because the fuel, ammunition, and transport required to sustain rapid movement had been diverted. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's gamble, promised a shortcut into Germany, but resulted instead in disaster. Paratroopers surrounded and destroyed, thousands dead, thousands more trapped behind enemy lines. The momentum that could have been seized by Patton evaporated in a haze of strategic indecision. Each day that the Allies waited, Germany used to rebuild defenses, conscript reserves, and fortify positions that should have already fallen. The opportunity of September 1944, a window that could have ended the war swiftly, was squandered, replaced by a month of attrition and suffering. By December, as the Ardennes offensive roared to life, the reality became undeniable. The Germans had seized the initiative, striking where Allied lines were thin and weak. Entire divisions were trapped and surrendered, casualties mounted, and the Allies were forced into a desperate defense. The blow was temporary, yes. The Wehrmacht could not sustain the offensive, but illustrated a chilling truth. Germany had survived when it should have been finished. The 6 weeks, months even, granted by Allied hesitation had allowed Model and his commanders to prepare, to concentrate forces, and to execute a plan that inflicted immense suffering. The lesson was clear to those who survived the war. Speed, decisiveness, and concentration of force mattered far more than political harmony or coalition appeasement. Patton had been correct all along, and the enemy confirmed it. The German generals were not shy in their assessments. Rundstedt, in particular, outlined a strategy that could have ended the war in September. Concentrate the strike, focus on northern Germany, break the weak defenses, and push relentlessly with armor and air support. Berlin might have been the ultimate goal, but the real strategic advantage lay elsewhere. Whoever controlled northern Germany controlled the fate of the entire nation. Allied air supremacy, combined with a swift and aggressive armored thrust, would have torn the front apart and forced a collapse that could not have been resisted. These were not hypotheticals or mere speculation. These were professional military assessments, delivered with blunt clarity by men who had commanded Germany's defense in the West. And yet, coalition politics prevented the execution of the very plan that would have saved thousands of lives and brought the war to a swifter conclusion. The broader picture was equally grim. As winter progressed, soldiers fought in forests, fields, and towns that could have been bypassed entirely if the Allies had acted decisively. Siegfried Line positions, weak in September, had to be assaulted head-on months later, costing countless lives. The Ardennes, frozen and unforgiving, became a grinding battlefield where every yard of ground was paid for in blood. Young men barely out of school fought and died in conditions that might never have existed, all because leadership had prioritized political considerations over military necessity. German generals, observing these campaigns, understood the tragedy in ways few Allied commanders ever could. They recognized the human cost of hesitation, the moral weight of indecision, and the strategic error of compromising speed for diplomacy. The war could have ended in autumn 1944. Instead, it stretched into a brutal winter, claiming lives that could have been spared. In these months, a pattern emerged that echoed across every front. Every time Eisenhower compromised, every time Montgomery and Patton competed for resources, Germany gained precious time. Every political decision intended to preserve alliance cohesion strengthened the enemy and prolonged the suffering. Rundstedt and other German commanders studied Allied command structures closely and understood the limitations imposed by coalition politics. They knew that concentration of force, while militarily obvious, was politically impossible. Speed and decisiveness were sacrificed to unity, and the consequences were written in the snow, mud, and graveyards of European theater. The lesson is stark and enduring. Leadership is measured not only by victories won, but by opportunities seized and hesitation, even when well-intentioned, carries a cost measured in human lives. By the turn of 1945, the consequences of the choices made in September 1944 had become undeniable. Germany, granted 6 weeks of breathing room by Allied hesitation, was finally facing the full weight of the coalition forces. But the cost had been staggering. Rivers had been crossed only after brutal assaults. Forests and towns had been captured at enormous human expense, and tens of thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded in places where a decisive strike months earlier might have rendered the fighting unnecessary. The German generals, who had survived by exploiting these delays, were clear-eyed in their assessments. Every battle that dragged into the cold winter months was a direct result of the Allies' broad front strategy, a strategy that had spread their strength and diluted their advantage. The war could have ended in 1944. It did not. And the reason was not German resilience. It was Allied hesitation. Historians have debated endlessly about what might have happened if Patton had been unleashed with full operational authority, driving a concentrated armored thrust to the open roads into northern Germany. Some argue that logistical challenges might have slowed even a rapid advance, or that the enemy could have mounted ad hoc resistance. But the German commanders who actually faced the threat saw things differently. Model had nothing in September. The Ruhr lay open, and the Siegfried Line was barely manned. German forces were scattered, fragmented, and demoralized. A single, relentless thrust at that moment would have shattered the front, captured key cities, and forced surrender before Germany had a chance to recover. The men who would have faced Patton confirmed it. It could not have been stopped. The enemy itself acknowledged the opportunity lost, and in that acknowledgement lies one of history's most haunting lessons about leadership, timing, and the cost of compromise. Even after Germany's eventual surrender in May 1945, the weight of those months was etched in every battlefield grave, in every telegram sent to families, in every frozen foxhole and ruined city. Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Manchefeld, and Model had all spoken to B.H. Little Heart, revealing with chilling clarity that the war could have ended far earlier, that the opportunity had been theirs for taking, and that political considerations had delayed the decisive action. Eisenhower, celebrated as a general who won the war, had indeed kept the alliance together, a monumental achievement, but the generals who had faced him and the German commanders he opposed remembered a different truth. The war might have been over by Christmas 1944 if speed had trumped diplomacy. There is a difference between winning a war and ending it as swiftly as possible, and history records both the triumph and the delay. The lessons of September 1944 are timeless, extending beyond the battlefields of Europe. They remind us that leadership is not measured solely by the victories achieved, but by the opportunities seized and the hesitation avoided. Coalition politics, compromise, and caution, virtues in some contexts, carry a cost when delay allows an enemy to recover, reorganize, and strike back. Little Hart's interviews make it clear. German generals were not boasting, nor were they seeking to diminish Allied accomplishments. They were delivering professional military judgment, unflinching and precise. They explained exactly what could have ended the war faster and why it did not. Every battle of the winter of 1944-45, every life lost in the Ardennes, every casualty in forests, rivers, and towns was a consequence of that delay. The human cost of hesitation is as real as the human cost of combat, and so the final chapters of the European War carry a dual legacy. Eisenhower's strategic diplomacy preserved an alliance that spanned continents, cultures, and armies, ensuring ultimate victory over the Reich. Yet the German general's testimony underscores the tragic price of indecision. The Ardennes, the Hürtgen Forest, the Siegfried Line, these were not just battlefields. They were the stages upon which opportunity was wasted, lives were lost, and the war was unnecessarily prolonged. The gift given to Germany in September 1944, a brief window of survival, a chance to regroup and resist, was a strategic choice made thousands of miles away, in conferences and briefings, in the name of coalition unity. It was a choice whose consequences were measured in blood, snow, and time. For students of history, for military leaders, and for those seeking to understand the true cost of decisions, the message is clear. In moments of decisive opportunity, hesitation can be as deadly as the enemy. The men who faced Germany's defenses and survived to tell the tale, both Allied and German, spoke with the authority of experience. Their verdict was unanimous. The war could have ended in the autumn of 1944. It did not, because political considerations, coalition management, and cautious compromise overrode the decisive application of force. History remembers victory, but also records a delay, the lost lives in the roads, forests, and towns where the consequences of hesitation were writ large. As we reflect on these lessons, it becomes evident that understanding the difference between speed and stability, concentration and dispersion, action and hesitation is vital, not just in war, but in any endeavor that demands decisive leadership. The German generals left us their testimony as a warning and a guide. Recognize the opportunity when it appears, and act with the force necessary to end conflict swiftly. Delay, no matter how well-intentioned, carries a cost measured in lives and lost momentum. And as we remember the battles of 1944 and 1945, it is worth asking the same question Little Hart posed. When faced with critical opportunity, were we listening? History does not forget, and neither do the graves. The decisions made in September 1944 reverberate through time, teaching us about leadership, courage, and the human cost of hesitation. The war eventually ended, but at a price that might have been avoided. In every grave, in every story, in every frozen battlefield, the echoes of that lost opportunity remain. And it is a reminder that while alliances, politics, and diplomacy are essential, they must never eclipse the urgency of action when decisive opportunity presents itself.